All right, so today we're going to talk about one topic to get us start on the class, which um, I found a little confusing when I was first learning. I remember for the longest time in JavaScript, I made a function with the keyword function. I just made functions one way. But it turns out there are kind of three different ways that I can count on ways to create functions. And I found that a little different because, again, when you come from, like, I don't know, my first language was Java, and Java was really strict, very different than JavaScript. And, like, you made functions pretty much one way back in the day with Java. And it was kind of similar to what you did in JavaScript. And so I found the fact that you can create functions in different ways confusing. But nonetheless, you can create functions different ways. There's basically newer, right? There's a newer approach, right? And what the newer approach really offers, I guess the reasoning why, is a condensed syntax. It lets you shorten your syntax, and that's nice, right? So let's go through the different ways. By the way, here's an emit to a module. We'll talk about what a module is here before long. But let's just do a traditional script source to main.js. Let's defer that. Now, here we'll see how long I do this, but even as I'm typing, you can kind of see that I've got this new plugin called GitHub Copilot. And if you're looking at my screen, you see the gray text. And that's Copilot kind of suggesting things to me. And that might be great, and it's going to help me, code in a different manner. But look, I want to do hello world, and it's somehow, well, it's pretty simply figuring out. I just wanted to do the hello world. Sure, hello world from main.js. And so, Copilot is now a plugin that I have enabled. Let's boot this up, and tells me the port, inspect the page, and hello world from main.js. Now it also failed to load the fave icon, which I'm not worried about that. There we go. That error. Not the point of this discussion. Let's start with probably the easiest syntax, easiest for me, to create a function, which is called a function declaration. So this syntax is called a function declaration. It starts with the keyword function, and then the name of your function, which I'll just call my function add. And there you go. GitHub Copilot is ridiculous. And you can actually see with this Copilot, it has multiple suggestions, right? So I can make a function called add or add numbers. Let's just do, sure, add numbers. Okay? So let's break this down. Since we're talking about functions. Function can take optional inputs. What are the inputs of my function? A little bit of wake up. They're called parameters. And what are my parameters? Num1 and num2. And num1 and num2 are just variables, right? They're just variables. Now, you are declaring variables here, right? So you might I kind of think of it like you're doing let num1. Now that's not the syntax. You don't declare a variable with the keyword let. In fact, these variables are block scope. If I try and console log, if I try and do a console log and I say num1, that's considered undescope, and it's even actually predicting correctly that num1 is undefined here, right? Because it is out of scope. Okay, so point is we have optional inputs. Okay, now if you want to make a function without inputs, then you just leave what's in these parentheses empty, and there you go. Okay, so functions can take 0 or many inputs, and they can also optionally return a value. Okay, it's done with the keyword return. You do not have to return something. Okay, so either a function can do work, and then that's it, and then you go back to the main portion of the code that's executing the next lines of your code, if you will, or your function can do something and then send some data back to the calling code, back to the calling function. Okay, so you got input parameters, 0 or many, and then you have 0 or 1 return value. Okay, and depending on the data type, like for example, these are presumably numbers, right? So if it's a numeric data type, you are going to pass by value, which means you're passing a copy of the data. But if you're passing an object data type, you're passing by reference. So you gotta, passing by value and passing by reference still exist in the JavaScript world. Okay, so all that, keeping that in mind, and this is one syntax for adding numbers. The console log then that we can do, console log add numbers 2, 3, and then if we kind of go back to our page, we should get the number 5, right? So inside of the console log, that's calling our function. So of course, functions have two parts, right? The function creating the function, and then of course calling the function, right? Basic stuff. Everyone good so far? Good morning. Everyone have their coffee? 1 coffee, 2 coffees? No coffees. No coffees. We got active coffee. This is good. All right. Let's wake up. I know. Hey, good. All right. Let's talk about another way. Function expression, right? You can do a function expression, which is taking an expression and kind of storing it in a variable. I kind of okay, let's take a look at this. Really the same exact thing. I just called my function something different. Okay, I called my function add instead of add numbers. Okay, but what I'm doing here is I'm taking a named function and storing it in a variable called add, and console log add, and if I say, just whatever. Okay, so this was kind of a newer syntax, my least favorite of the 3. Like, I don't really use this syntax very much, but what this is doing is taking a named function. It's taking a named function like this and storing it in a variable, and then ultimately when you call the variable, it calls the named function. And we have 2 input parameters, and it returns the value. We should then get the value back of 6. So when I have a named function, I typically use this syntax, or I use the arrow function. Okay, now the arrow function is very similar. I got to have a new identifier here. Add, I'll just call it add nums equals, and here's my arrow syntax. You can see it's actually just more condensed than the function above. Okay, so we are still creating a variable. We still have inputs, parameters, and it still returns the values added together. And if I console log add nums and I say 4, 3, of course I should get 7 out, and we do. So, I just wanted to take the first minute of this class to kind of talk about the 3 different ways that you can declare functions, and how in general, like that, I understand how that can be confusing. I've found it a little confusing myself. A little bit more on this arrow function though. A little bit more on this arrow function. Turns out, if you only have one statement, you don't need these curlies. You can actually delete these curlies. And when you only have one statement, and that statement is a return, you actually don't need the return either. So you can actually condense this arrow function down even more when it doesn't do a whole lot. And it just returns one value, right? So this is going to function just the same way in a more condensed syntax, right? I'm sure you guys have heard of syntactic sugar, right? That's just kind of like, that's kind of a nice thing. That's a sweet little thing that you can do, which again they call the fun word of syntactic sugar is condensing that down. Let's make another arrow function. Const, I'll just say do work equals. If you don't have any parameters, you can do an empty arrow return console log working. So you can even kind of condense that syntax down even more. And console, actually this returns a console log, so I can just call it do work, okay, which will return a console.log with the word working, and there you have it. Okay, so this arrow function is a nice condensed syntax. You know how to do it without parameters. If it has multiple statements though, you will put those multiple statements inside of curly braces. Right, so now my do work has multi statements, therefore the curlies are required. Right, so now I get my function that does that has 2 statements in it, right? Statements ending in semicolons. A really good article on the arrow function is on MDN, of course. Did I say this, by the way? These arrow functions, see how these arrow functions are different than this function expression? Here, this is a named function, but arrow functions, so what would I say here? Line 9 creates a variable that stores a named function. Okay, kind of weird to think about. Okay, that's a functional programming thing. So line 9, we have a variable that stores a named function. Line 15 is creating a variable that stores an anonymous function. Okay, what is an anonymous function? It's a block of code. It's a function that you can call, but it doesn't have a name. Right? So arrow functions actually store anonymous functions. Okay, so just kind of pointing that out, that this is in fact a variable that stores, that is assigned a value of an anonymous function. So here we call it an arrow function expression. And I found the other thing, okay, as you can kind of see here, when you have no parameters, okay, so let's talk about this arrow function. By the way, guys and gals, if in this class, we're going to use this a lot. We're going to use these arrow functions a lot. Okay, so zone in with me here, because you're going to see me coding this in different syntax, and you need to understand the differences. Okay, so this function, this is an anonymous function that has no parameters. Okay, when you have no parameters, these parentheses are mandatory. Okay, the only time I'm going to make another arrow function, and instead of hello world, I'll say do work 2. Okay, so this function, and I'm just going to call this, num. Now, this function, this anonymous function, has one parameter. Okay, the only time these parentheses are considered optional are when your arrow function only has one parameter. Okay, so I can actually wrap this parameter in parentheses, and that's cool. And then I can make this a, I can make this a template string and put the parameter in my okay. So notice here, when I have this function with one parameter, I can choose to either include these parentheses or leave them off. So I say do work 2, I'm going to pass it in the number 2, and here I'm calling do work 2, passing in the number 2, right? And if I pass it in the number 20, of course, it says do work 20. Okay? So when I'm looking at this article, what am I reading? Okay, you can start with no parameters and return an expression. Again, this, when you don't have the keyword return, what comes here is being returned. Remember what's happening on the right here. This is a single statement that is being returned. There is an implied return keyword. Just like right here, there's an implied parentheses. This syntax sugar is implying a lot of things here. Okay? But that's why you get the condensed syntax. So here's, okay, so you have one parameter. You can include the parentheses or not. If you have any more, then you need parentheses, right? If you have any more than one parameter, then the parentheses are required. So I just put the parentheses in myself because that's safe. Right? It's just safer. There's only one condition where they're not required. Sure, they save you a couple of keystrokes, but whatever. Okay. Now, if you have multiple statements, so an expression is a single, your single statement. That's why the expression's in red. You got the single statement. Multiple statements then are required to have curlies, and I think we've covered that. Okay. So this is getting into some different things that aren't really around the function itself. So I'm not going to focus on that. Okay. And what I found useful, and I'm just going to kind of copy this, and we can bring it in to my editor. just to get some color. Okay. So in JavaScript, we haven't done a lot of anonymous functions. I don't think you guys got exposure to a traditional anonymous function. But here's a function without a name. Takes one input parameter and returns one, that input plus 100. So when we apply the arrow function, okay, so this is a traditional anonymous function. One input parameter in parentheses, arrow, curlies, return a plus 100. Okay, so this is replacing the traditional anonymous function with an arrow function. Right, so you could view this as the first step in using an arrow function. The second step is, well, hey, you only have a single return statement, so you can delete the parentheses. So that's what they do here. And because it's a return statement, you can actually delete the word return, and this, what is originally lines 23 through 25, can be replaced by line 33, right? I don't care if you've never seen JavaScript or not. You're a developer. You want to write concise code, okay? And so simply looking at lines 23, 24, and 25 versus line 33, and knowing those two things do the same thing, right? Of course, we're going to want to use the syntax that's most condensed, which is line 33. Okay, so 3 ways to create functions, and kind of a little bit deeper dive on the arrow function itself and how it works. Okay, in this class primarily we're going to use a lot of arrow functions, so hopefully you paid attention and gained something out of this conversation. And just as function declaration, you're still going to see me use some of that because frankly, that's the one that I've been coding for the longest amount of time. So I find a bit of comfort in it because it's just the oldest and I've used it a lot, right? But certainly we'll be using arrow functions. Any questions around what I've covered so far? Yes? Yeah. Here? Sure. Other questions? No, we will be using anonymous functions. Yeah, we will be using anonymous functions. In particular, so anytime you see the arrow function, you're using an anonymous function. An arrow function stores an anonymous function. Okay?